Hey, you guys, this is a somewhat beleaguered Professor Vitt joining you for a discussion on sources. Sources, very generally, is a way of talking about where we get our information. And as a critical thinker, it's really important that you develop an ability to pay attention to the source of information or the source of a claim. And our overriding principle here is going to be garbage in, garbage out. So the idea is this, right? If I am a world class chef and someone hires me to bake a cake, it won't matter how utterly fantastic a chef I am if the eggs that I'm using are rotten. And so the same thing is true of you as a thinker and as a person. It doesn't matter how smart you are, if you're getting bad facts or bad claims, then you're going to have bad conclusions. And so that's kind of the overriding principle behind this course. Now, perhaps the most immediate application of this is to diversity in our media. So particularly now, as of the recording of this video, we're living in a really politically hyper-partisan atmosphere. In other words, somebody who is on the left is super far on the left, and somebody on the right is often super far on the right. And one of the problems is that the left and the right, they're using different sources, so they're coming up with different conclusions. And so the best thing that we can do is to try to remind ourselves to diversify our media experience, right? Now, I'm obviously not watching what you do, but this would be one practical extension of this course. On both sides of the aisles right now, people are politically saying, well, you know what? The other side is just all they do is get their news from one source. Well, that's probably true, right? And so it's important to try and get your news from different sources so that you have a more full and a more round understanding of events and how they're occurring. Remember, you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you're only getting your news from the New York Times, your worldview won't be as broad as it could be, right? Even if you don't agree with alternate news sources, maybe you don't agree with NPR, it still benefits you to be exposed to that information because it gives you a corrective, right? It gives you a way to say, oh, I see what the other side is saying, but here's why it's wrong. And so that's just one kind of corollary or extension of sources. Make sure that you diversify your sources. And the greater the diversity of sources, the better off you're going to be. Okay, you guys, so in Chapter 3, as we're talking about sources, I'm going to break sources into kind of 6 big parts. At least this is the overview of it, right? Now, this is based in part on what Smith does in the book. It's not exactly perfect, so we're just going to go with it, right? So let me start at the beginning here with this category, testimony and anecdote. Now, we talked about this, I believe, last week a little bit, but anecdote is just a fancy way of saying story, right? And there are problems with stories as proof. Stories are easy to make up. Stories can be tough to verify, particularly if they're super far away in time or someone's had possession of the story for a long time. Lots and lots of cases where somebody has this story and they publish it. Oh, I've had this in the attic for 40 years. Well, who was looking at the story in that time? Most of the time when you have a manuscript that's sat around like that, it's very common for people to introduce details into the manuscript or the story as they have possession of the story, and it's very hard to check. So remember about anecdotes. They're not great for evidence. They might be a place to start, but they're easy to fabricate. They can be tough to check. The next category, and this is in part from Dr. Smith, is ancient texts. Now, ancient texts really are just, a category of stories or anecdotes. There are 2 kinds of problems with ancient texts and evaluating claims made in ancient texts. Number 1, you're talking about a translation. Most of the time, an ancient text is in a language that we don't speak unless we're Greek scholars or Sumerian scholars or something like that. And so translating those claims into our language can be tough. This happens with Atlantis a lot. The Greek language, the classical Greek language is, a couple few thousand years old. And so it's not exactly clear whether or not a term used then really means the same thing that we have now. And this leads into a second problem with ancient texts. So the first one is translation. The second problem with ancient texts is we're usually really far removed from the context. We'll see this in this chapter when we talk about Springheeled Jack, this monster figure that is in Victorian England. It's just really hard to say what things were like back then because it's been thousands and thousands of years, and sometimes we get it wrong or there's no way to know. So ancient texts can be suspect as a source for claims. Next up, fallacies. Fallacies are errors in reasoning. It's a fancy way to say you did it wrong. So when dealing with sources, there are usually three fallacies that come up the most. I'll just give you an overview of them here. The first one that comes up often is called appeal to authority. Now, in our day-to-day lives, it's totally okay to appeal to someone who knows more about a subject than we do. We do it all the time, and we probably couldn't get by without that. However, just because an expert who's devoted their lives to studying something and so they know more about it, just because an expert says something doesn't make it true. So I could go up and give a discussion about critical thinking, but and the fact that I'm an expert on critical thinking may lend some credibility to what I'm saying, but it doesn't make what I'm saying true, right? So just because someone says something, it doesn't mean it's true. So when you're evaluating a source, you have to be aware of that first and foremost. Second thing, oftentimes people will serve as an expert in a case, talking about inflation or medical costs or something like that, and their area of expertise is not the area that they're talking about. So if I have a PhD in economics, why would I go up and give a discussion on childhood development, right? I just wouldn't have the expertise for it. So you have to be careful that there's an alignment between what the speaker is saying and what they're talking about, and also that you don't rely so heavily on the speaker that you just assume what they say is true. The last fallacy that you uncover in sources has to do with these ancient texts, and it's called appeal to tradition or appeal to ancient wisdom. And the idea here is that just because people have been doing something for a long period of time, or just because people have said something or believe something for a long period of time, it doesn't make it true. So an example of this might be slavery, right? At one point in time, people were arguing, look, we have had slavery in some form or another for thousands of years in Western culture. We should continue to do this. This is a natural thing or whatever, right? That's actually a different fallacy. But the idea that people appeal to a past practice in order to justify a current practice. But remember, just because people have done something for a long time or people did something in the past doesn't mean that we should then do it ourselves. Look, the ancient people did key into certain things that were helpful. The Egyptians used an eye makeup that actually helped to prevent parasitic infections. They had no idea that they were preventing parasitic infections with a lead-based makeup, but they were. So you'll find things in ancient texts that are actually correct, things that are right, but it doesn't always mean that the people who were writing these things down knew that they were right or knew why what they were saying was correct. Okay, and then let's move on here, Bria. I don't want to get bogged down. Let's talk about mass media and the internet for a second. There's one word that you need to remember here, and that's cash, right? It's the big dollar sign. Media and stuff that you consume over the internet, if it's news, if it's entertainment, whatever it is, took hundreds of hours to produce, right? One short video segment takes lots and lots of people, usually, right? It takes sound techs and engineers and writers and producers and blah, 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 blah. All of that stuff gets packaged to you. So realize that when you turn on the TV or you flip on a YouTube video, somebody spent a lot of time making that video maybe look a certain way or appeal to certain interests that you have so that you will watch it, so that you'll click on it. And trying to make a video that someone will watch or click on is not always the same thing as watching a video that is true, right? So keep in mind, media, generally speaking, has the goal of making money. And so stories that sell tend to float up to the top. Personalities that produce these videos that are, loud and obnoxious. If they get more views, then those people go to the top. It doesn't mean that those people are right, though, okay? So you have to be careful. Authority we've talked about here briefly. One of the points of critical thinking is to question the assumptions that we've always lived with. And so part of critical thinking is really and truly questioning tradition. It doesn't mean you have to throw tradition away. Don't do that. But it means you have to ask the question, why are we doing this? Is this a good thing to do? And that will make the tradition itself, when you ask that question, will make it stronger, right? Because you'll actually know and understand and give foundation to maybe something that you've done all the time or something that you've always believed, but you've believed it maybe without the benefit of having a justification for it. So that's just a general rule about authority. And then the next thing, science. 2 points about science as a source. Look, I love science. I think it's fantastic and it's great. I don't think there's any doubt about that. However, it's not perfect, right? And very often scientists suffer science suffers from what's called a publication bias. And all that a publication bias means is scientists gain recognition by publishing studies. And when those studies are positive, they get more recognition. When your study is not successful, when you don't find some interesting connection, it's harder to publish your study, right? Because you're basically saying, hey, look at this amazing study. It cost $3 million in 10 years. Oh, by the way, I found nothing, right? Well, journals don't want to publish those studies. They're not very interesting. So science itself is it takes place within a human framework, so it's not always right. And sometimes studies that get rushed to publication are just that, they're rushed. And years later, people have to revise them or issue corrections. And people don't see those corrections years later. They just see this big study that says Diet Coke cures Alzheimer's or something like that. That brings us to our second point about science, and that is science news reporting is often bad, right? The people who report science news are not always the same people. In fact, they're seldom the same people who are doing the science. And so keep in mind that a scientific study that may be a breakthrough would require really years of training to understand and explain properly. But news agencies don't have that luxury, so they send a reporter or somebody who tries to understand the study and writes up a nice article about it. But that's not always correct. And so you do have to be careful, right, with regard to certain science publications as to news. I mean, they're good and they're great, but you can't take it to the bank. And so that brings us to one of the most important fallacies that we're going to cover with regard to sources. It's such an important fallacy. I've actually given it its own little slide, its own category, and it's called the genetic fallacy. And all that this fallacy means is the source of a claim, right, where or who the source is, or where a claim comes from, doesn't determine whether or not the claim is true. So let me give an example of this. Suppose someone's, working in a state legislative house, right? Somewhere where they're making laws for a state. And somebody says, oh gosh, I've got this new bill. Somebody says, oh, who authored the bill? Who wrote the bill? Somebody says, oh, the National Rifle Association wrote this bill. And you can imagine somebody says, well, what's it about? And they say, it's about gun control. Well, certain people might say, no, that's going to be an awful bill. I don't like the NRA, and so I don't like this legislation. That would be a fallacy. The only way that you could tell whether or not the law was a good one would be by reading it. Maybe the NRA writes a killer bill. Maybe it's a great bill because they know the industry, they know the issues, they know the liabilities. Who knows? But I do know that you cannot just say, well, this claim comes from this organization, and so the claim has to be false. No, it doesn't work that way, right? You need to evaluate the content of the claim. So the genetic fallacy is it's a fallacy based on the form of a claim, meaning how the claim is made, right? Who particularly is making the claim, rather than what the claim says. So look out for that type of example. Look for that kind of fact pattern in your exam this week. It's super common. All right, you guys, so I kind of mentioned this just a second ago, but we divide claims into two parts. We look at the content of the claim, so what is it that the claim is saying? Is there a specific enough claim being made here that we could actually test it? So an example, let's suppose I say, oh, macadamia nut oil cures cancer. Well, have I made a very specific claim there? You know, normally when you talk about medical treatments, you talk about the dosage, right? So how many cc's of something or how many milligrams relative to the height and weight and age of the person. That's one part of it. Also, another part is, you know, how is it vectored into your body? Are you taking pills? Are you being, you know, is it being injected intravenously? Is it absorbed through the patch on somebody's arm, right? When somebody makes a claim like, you know, macadamia nut oil cures cancer, they're not being very specific, actually. I mean, do you need to drink it? Do you need to bathe in it? Do you need to swim in it? How would this work? And so be careful when someone's making a claim, make sure that it's specific enough that you can actually test it, right? That's the perfect goal. Now, not all claims are going to be that specific, but it's a great thing to shoot for. The other thing to look at when you're evaluating a claim is the form of the claim. Okay, this is a fancy way of saying how does the claim get to you. So, if I am investigating a claim about Bigfoot, am I getting that claim from a paper written by Jeffrey Meldrum, or am I getting that claim from watching the History Channel, right? And the History Channel is a cable news show. And its job is to sell airtime, right? It's a product. They want you to consume it. Which of these two is more likely to be geared towards truth? Well, probably an academic paper would be. More so, at least hopefully, not always, but hopefully that would be a different form. Same types of claims, but presented in very different contexts. Also, what's important about the form of a claim is how quickly the claim was written down, if it's about an event. So if a ball of lightning flies through my house right now, I would probably write it down or make a record of it immediately. If it was 200 years ago, I'd write it in my diary that day. If it's now, I'd probably try to do a YouTube video of it or something, right? The longer the period of time that stretches between when the event happened and the claim is recorded concerning the event, the longer that period of time, the less and less and less and less likely that claim is going to be true for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, in the telling and retelling of a story, the story changes. It depends on your audience, your context, what you want to bring forward, but that just happens, right? And then the second thing is memories fade and memories change. And so, but someone's confidence in their memory doesn't. So you may feel that you remember very vividly what happened 5 years ago in a massive breakup with an ex. But I assure you, if you talk to that ex, you'd probably have very, very different accounts of what happened. And I think the same thing is true for most of the claims in our lives. In fact, there's great evidence of this. If you look at some of the research from psychologists, somebody like Elizabeth Loftus, our memories are not very good. We'll talk about this later on. I'm kind of getting off track. And then the other thing that's important is the custody. So I think a great example of this is a philosopher named Nietzsche, whose sister gets a hold of his writings and then she kind of changes them over time. And certain scholars noticed, that there was this disconnect between different bodies of his work, and it was eventually unearthed that she changed some of his writings. This happens a lot, right? Somebody gets a hold of a story and they sort of change it over time. So it's the reason why this is important is it's one more way for a claim to go bad, right? And what we want to do is maximize the number of our true beliefs and minimize our false ones. So if we can build into our decision making, our checklist, we can build in, these are how these things are going to go wrong, then we'll be more likely to put the appropriate amount of weight on a particular claim because we know whether or not it would be reliable. So again, Form is how it comes to you. Is it media? Is it an academic article? Is it your friend, right? How is this claim being made? And then the next one is the content. What is being said? Is it specific? Do we have to interpret it? Etc., etc., etc. Okay, so now we're going to talk about astrology. And astrology is the claim that the position of the stars and the planets at the time of our birth determines our personalities and even specific events within our own lives. If you did a Google search, in fact, this number's stale. It's probably much higher than that. I think it's about 60 million now. If you do a Google search, you'll get tens of millions of hits on astrology. And the idea here is that it is super popular. My own mother loves astrology. She's always going on about, she says, oh, Robert, right? I'm a Virgo too. Well, I'm not even a Virgo, so I don't even know what that means, but whatever, right? So the point here is that it's okay if you like astrology, right? Lots of students do, and they find it meaningful for them. Great. I'm glad to hear it. It's very, very, that's fine. It's just not relevant, right? Instead, what we're doing is we're taking practices which tend to promote truth, and then we're applying them to all these different examples that we have. So astrology is going to be one of them. Now, the first thing to note, actually, this is a more important point I almost skipped. Astrology is super popular, but just because something is super popular doesn't mean that it's true. And so people the world over from many different cultures have some form of astrology, but that doesn't mean that astrology is even remotely accurate or likely to be true. And that's an important distinction, because part of a critical thinker is the ability to think for yourself apart from the crowd, right? Apart from the mass of people of which you are part. So, again, you're not tested on this, whether or not astrology is true, but you have to know the arguments sort of for and against it. All right. The first thing to notice about astrology is that it's pre-modern. What does that mean? It means astrology is before the advent of the industrial and scientific revolution of the last couple hundred years. So the ancients actually knew some things about reality, but the things that they knew, they tended to know by lucky guess, by a lucky chance. Almost everything about reality that we know, we have come to know in the last few centuries. And this is the sort of advance of science. And so we can't say, oh gosh, astrology comes from the ancients, and the ancients were really not very knowledgeable, so this must be false. We can't do that. Remember, that would be the genetic fallacy, right? So we have to investigate it on its own merits. We're just not entitled to dismiss something because it comes from an ancient culture. There are lots and lots of different kinds of astrology. There's Arabic, there's Vedic, there's Babylonian, Persian, Chinese, Egyptian, there's tarot astrology, there's something called electional astrology, I don't know, and so forth, right? It goes on and on. Now, the thing that's difficult about this is that these different astrological systems are contradictory, meaning your reading in Vedic astronomy cannot be translated into the Babylonian calendar. They'll give you different forms of advice, different things to do, different traits, and so they couldn't both be right. So this is a big deal. So, all right, I'm just going to bring up a few points here about astrology. And if you're watching at home, you can see the acronym here is LSD, right? The first thing is astrology appears to violate the laws of thought, which means astrologists claim contradictory things, right? You can take two astrologers from the very same school, right? So maybe they're both using the Babylonian calendar, which is what we use typically in the West. You know, Cancer, Virgo, Pisces, Gemini, all that stuff. You can take two astrologers, both of them following those charts, and they will give you different readings for the same person. Well, you cannot, they couldn't both be right, Okay, it's like a fundamental law of the universe that something cannot be both true and false at the same time. So it can't be true that the astrological chart says today John is going to fall in love, and the astrological chart also says today John will lose love or be unlucky in love. And so very often when you go to astrologers, you get these contradictory readings, and they can't both be correct. So remember, when we're evaluating claims, we want things to be consistent. We want things to make sense. And astrology, because it has such a variety of results, doesn't seem to follow that rule. The next thing about astrology is no one knows how it works, okay? There are four basic forces in the universe. There's gravity, strong force, weak force, and electromagnetic energy. Electromagnetic force, excuse me. Astrology doesn't avail itself of any of those things, right? So someone might say, right now you are in the, Mars is affecting your behavior. Well, that's just incorrect. I mean, Mars has a gravitational force that is acting upon my body. That's true, but it's not making me more curious or more happy, right? There are other things, right? The computer is probably using more gravitational force than Mars is right now, and it would be strange to say that the computer is affecting my mood or the events in my life. So it's not clear how astrology works. Now, we have some idea as to how it's supposed to work, but it doesn't really help us much. Let me give you an example. So this person on the left was born on October the 18th, 1939. That makes them a Libra. Libras are concerned with justice and fairness. Why? Well, this is the sign for Libra, and it looks like a scale, right? You have this little here tipped here, and then you have two stars. Okay, so apparently the thinking was with Babylonians that this particular star constellation looks like a scale, and so people who are born under this sign in the sky are themselves concerned with fairness and justice. So what's the connection? These stars look like some earthly artifact that we use to measure, and so we think that people who are born there are concerned with moral fairness or something like that. It's tough to say, right, that would be correct. For many reasons, one of which is, you could pick any number of constellations in the sky. This is kind of cherry picking, right? And many of them wouldn't look like a scale. So that's difficult. Also, it just doesn't seem to have any evidence, right? This person really wasn't concerned with justice and fairness. This individual was Lee Harvey Oswald. He killed the President of the United States. And this is a problem with astrology, is that when you try to submit it to testing, when you look and say, okay, these people are Libras, is there any trait in their personality or lives which indicates that they all share some trait? The answer time and again is, no, right? So we don't know how astrology works. How did the Babylonians actually set this up? How did they figure out that people who were born under the scales were more fair? Did they go around their local village and ask people? And then, we don't have any of those records. So it's hard to say how you could establish that these relations would hold. Also, when we look to see whether these relations hold, they don't. There's just not a lot of evidence that astrology is an effective tool. We know that other things are. We know that DNA plays a huge role in your behavior, shaping your life and so forth. You could just change a couple of proteins and absolutely everything about you would be different. And this is, the Babylonians didn't know about DNA. So again, this is kind of contrasting our level of knowledge with the Babylonians and asking, well, if they were able to establish this connection, how did they do it? Because we know of other things that are much bigger roles in your behavior, right, than just the shape of constellations at your birth. Another problem with astrology that people have is astrology tends not to react to new evidence. So for many, many years, it was known that our modern astrological system that we have from the Babylonians actually missed a sign, the Ophiuchus. And it wasn't corrected until recently. In fact, even now you'll find people who still just don't use that sign. In other words, the position of the stars and the tilt of the earth now is different than it was with the Babylonians, but astrologers just keep using the old stuff. Well, that's not how it should work. Remember, we sometimes talk about an analogy of a clock that tells the wrong time. The astrological calendar that we have now and that most people use is missing this sign. And so they're using, they're effectively using a broken clock. And if it gets something right, it gets it right by accident. So I hope that's helpful. This is just a basic comparison between science and astrology. There are some commonalities here, right? And so I can see how astrology is fascinating in that sense. I mean, they both attempt to explain our behavior in the natural world, right? Oh, this person is, very fiery, very stubborn because they're a Taurus, and that's what Tauruses are, right? Because it's a bull. So they try to predict behavior and explain behavior, and that's a trait that science shares. So generally, that's good, right? We want to try to develop models about the world. Now, astrology does generate predictions and behaviors, somewhat, but those predictions and behaviors haven't been borne out by empirical data. Now, this last box is just differences between science and astrology. The first one is scientists are always looking for alternatives, right? Science is kind of built to try and prove itself wrong. So scientists are always trying to defeat their own theories and consider alternatives. Astrologers don't. Astrologers tend to lay all of the blame and the fault of the stars and then walk away rather than say, well, maybe it wasn't the stars, maybe it was because, XYZ, right? Maybe John's behavior is more well explained not by the stars, but the fact that he had a divorce the other day and he's upset today, right? His divorce was finalized on Wednesday. Today is Thursday. He's not upset because he's whatever astrological sign. He's upset because he just went through a divorce, right? Also, science is huge on peer review, meaning if you're a scientist and you have some great test result, you're going to show that to everybody. You want people to know what you've discovered and you're discovering. Astrology doesn't really work that way. Astrologers don't review one another's readings or anything like that in the same way that you do with science. And then lastly, this point here about science considers and changes with new evidence. So, theories about genes that made sense in the 1980s are just obsolete now. We just know more about genetic structure and how traits in genes flow through to the, mature organisms and so forth. We just know more. But astrology, remember with the Ophiuchus, doesn't change over time and it stays the same, and so it doesn't react to new evidence. Hey you guys, so this is Professor Vitt, and we're going to use this little module here to talk about a very famous monster from Victorian England, Springheeled Jack. Springheeled Jack is going to let us talk about claims, he's going to let us talk about sources, and he's going to let us talk a little bit more about anecdotes as evidence. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, Springheeled Jack actually starts to make an appearance in 1837, but those accounts are kind of muddled, so I'm going to focus on two different accounts here. The first one comes from February the 20th of 1838 from a woman named Jane Alsop. Jane is at home with her family. I believe she is not married. She's with her family, her mother, her father, and I think her sisters. There's a knock on the door at sometime after 9. She comes to the door and asks who it is, and the man on the other side says, ma'am, we've got Springheeled Jack here, caught him in the lane. Can you hurry up and fetch us a light? Bring us a light. So Jane goes, gets the light, she opens the door, and standing in front of her is this horrific demonic figure named Springheeled Jack, and he blows a blue fireball into her face, and I think he actually tries to attack her too. So it sets off, it's a harrowing experience for her, and it ends up in what are essentially the local papers. There is then another attack on April the 13th of 1838. It actually takes place in one of these yards here. We're not sure which one it was, but it was one of these. And this is the clipping here, so you can kind of read it on your own. I'll just read it very briefly. Springheeled Jack has found his way to the Sussex coast. I guess I could try to do a British accent, but it wouldn't work well, and it would be annoying. On Friday evening between 9 and 10 o'clock, he appeared to a gardener near Rose Hill, quote, in the shape of a bear or some other four-footed animal. And having first attracted attention by a growl, then mounted the garden wall, covered as it was with broken glass, and ran along it upon all fours. So this is kind of crazy, right? There's a wall. It's protected by glass, broken bits of glass that are set into the wall, and the creature just runs along it like there's no problem. Let's see. The gardener was going to leave in terror when Springheeled Jack leaped down from the wall, chased him for some time. He called his dog, but the dog was as terrified as his master. And then Springheeled Jack scaled the wall and made his exit. The fellow may probably amuse himself in this way once too often. The Brighton Gazette. So what happens is Springheeled Jack, over a period of decades, begins to make appearance after appearance in Victorian England. And so people see this figure, they see him in different forms, but one thing that seems to be common is once folks are chasing him, there's a big huge wall or a big huge building, and he leaps over it and out of sight. So, just a quick side note, appearances for Springheeled Jack usually run between 1838 and 1904. When we look at the penny dreadfuls of the day, when we look at the different circulars that were kind of in use, so the different papers that people were reading at the time, we find that Springheeled Jack doesn't appear as often when the House of Parliament is in session. I'm just going to point that out now, and it'll become important a little bit later on why. Okay, so let's talk about Springheeled Jack as to the type of evidence that we have for him. The type of evidence that we have for Springheeled Jack is wholly and entirely anecdotal, right? We don't have any physical evidence for Springheeled Jack. We don't have any of his boots. We don't have any springs. We don't even have any of the clothing. In some accounts, Springheeled Jack is said to have actually torn clothing and left marks on people. We don't have any of that stuff left. And again, anecdotes, if you don't recall, it's just a fancy name for a story, right? It's all an anecdote is. Now in court, when we're normally trying to decide something in a court of law, and someone is telling a story, we call anecdotes something special in law. We call it hearsay. And hearsay is just an out-of-court assertion offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Don't worry, you don't need to know that. But what you do need to know is courts are very suspicious about hearsay. It's incredibly unreliable. It's easy to make up. And so there is an exhaustive set of rules for how you deal with hearsay in a trial. There are exemptions to hearsay, and there are exceptions to hearsay, and they do different things, right? An exemption pulls something out of its class as a here's da 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 da. It goes on and on. We're not studying for the bar, so we're not going to get into it. What you need to know is, as a practical matter, when it comes to a discussion of stories as evidence, we normally treat them pretty circumspectly. In other words, we're dubious. We don't believe it, right? We're a little bit suspicious of them. Anecdotes are bad evidence. They're bad evidence because they're not open for inspection. We can't go and see exactly what took place in April of 1838. We just don't know what happened to that farmer, how that attack went. We just don't have any way to know. Also, anecdotes often provide multiple different accounts of what happened, what happened with regard to an event. So if 5 people watch an event, you'll probably get 3 to 4 different versions of whatever it was that happened. And this happens with Springheeled Jack, right? Springheeled Jack makes an appearance as a knight. Here he is, right, as a knight, apparently committing some kind of adventure or something in England. Here he is as a ghost, right? Now this is called the Aldershot ghost, but this is later morphed into Springheeled Jack. Springheeled Jack is also depicted as the devil, right, or as a devil. Here he is doing devilish things. Here he is, Springheeled Jack, as a demon. Now, what the difference is between a demon and a devil, I don't know. You'd have to ask the people writing these stories, right? But the point is, you get these multiple different stories about what's happening, and we're stuck. How do we decide between these different accounts? Do we take only those things that are common to each one of the stories, that he jumps over a building? Do we take those reports that are most recent, right? So because they're more likely to be true. I mean, do we say that he's one of each? So he's a demon and a ghost, right? I mean, we just don't know, and it's hard to pick how we could harmonize all of these different stories into one story. And so you're kind of stuck, right? Are they all true and it's a shapeshifter? Who knows, right? We can't tell, and we can't come up with a great answer because all we have are these stories, right? So another big problem with Springheeled Jack is this stuff happened, 200 years ago now. We can't verify the accuracy. I mean, the wall that he ran on is now gone for sure. We wouldn't even know which wall it was. Most of the buildings, presumably, that he was running around are probably, many of them anyway, some of them are probably gone. So we don't have any way to verify the accuracy of these anecdotes. And that's troubling if we want to ensure that the things that we believe are true. And if we can't verify whether these stories are accurate, then we probably shouldn't accept them as true. Okay, so remember, we have all these different stories. We're trying to figure out, right, what is true? We have all these different stories. Is it one person in every one of these stories? Is it Springheeled Jack shape-shifting from one form to another? Are these all different people, right? There's a demon and there's a ghost, and they're all doing different work. Are all of these stories hallucinations? Are all of these stories fake? Are all of these stories true? We just don't know. Are some true and some false? We just don't know, and anecdotes themselves don't give us any way to solve this kind of an answer. Now, when we look at this story, we might be inclined to say, my God, how can so many different people, who all of whom have read these stories, still believe in Springheeled Jack? And people did believe in Springheeled Jack, right? I mean, there are stories about people coming up with who the identity of Springheeled Jack is. We'll talk about that in a little bit. People tell their children, don't be out late, Springheeled Jack will get you. What's going on? If we have all these different stories about a creature and none of the stories are the same, why do people think that it's real? I mean, normally if I tell you, oh, yesterday I went to a concert, and you said, oh, fantastic, what was the concert? And I said, it was a jazz concert, okay, and it took place at, the Long Beach City College auditorium at 12 p.m. And then you go to one of your friends and they tell you, yeah, I was at that concert too yesterday at 12 p.m., right? Same date, same time, but it wasn't a jazz concert, it was a heavy metal concert. Well, I mean, are you going to assume that we're both right? Are you going to say, well, maybe there wasn't a concert, or if there was a concert, right? It seems like if we were both perceiving something real, then we wouldn't come up with such different ideas about it. So how do these ideas kind of float around? How do these stories get going? Well, it's something called communal reinforcement. And I'm going to give you the super fancy reading here of the name communal reinforcement. It's a social phenomenon. It occurs when a concept or an idea is repeatedly asserted in a community of fact. And over time, that concept or idea becomes kind of a fixed belief in many people's minds. It becomes truth by repetition. And so An example of that modernly would be UFOs. Now, you may or may not believe that UFOs are extraterrestrials from another planet, but there are people who believe this, right? And these people are not insane. They're normal people, just like you and I, but they have this extraordinary belief. And so the question is, well, how does this get going? Well, they will tell you it gets going because it's real. Okay, so that just at the forefront, that would be their argument. But other people would say, look, what's really going on is you have no physical evidence for these claims. So we don't really have very good trace evidence for flying saucers. It's not like people pull out their cell phones and are capturing flying saucers, abducting people everywhere. Instead, what happens is people get together. They have conferences, UFO conferences, or chat rooms online, and they tell and retell these stories, and they prop up these anecdotes then as fact, and it becomes a feature of the community that these things are fact, and you are not able to question it. If you are, you'll be shunned or ostracized from the community. And so this is the idea behind communal reinforcement, right? And here it is beautifully. I already had it all set up, but I didn't need to switch the slide to do it, but that's okay. It is what it is, folks. You got to go with it, right? Life is a dragon. Okay. How does this relate to Springheeled Jack? Well, different communities in London at the time, and even later, had different theories about Springheeled Jack, right? So they have no physical evidence of this creature, and yet these stories are alive and well in their communities and doing different things. So, for instance, the aristocrats in London at the time thought that Springheeled Jack was the Marquis of Waterford. Who is this guy? He's an aristocrat. He had a lot of money, and he was a jerk. Maybe you've heard of that phrase, paint the town red. That comes from this person. And apparently what he did one night was he and all of his buddies got completely drunk and then painted a bunch of stuff red, and I think even they beat up a police officer. And it was an outrage, right? I mean, they beat people up, they tore the town apart, and he went to trial. If he went to trial, it was very briefly, right? He was kind of insulated. And so people thought, the accounts that we hear about Springheeled Jack are consistent with the stuff that this guy used to do. And so maybe Springheeled Jack is the Marquis of Waterford. This theory went out the window when the Marquis of Waterford died, and they put him in the ground, and Springheeled Jack kept on appearing. So that theory kind of fell apart. Believe it or not, Springheeled Jack somehow moves to Czechoslovakia right after and during World War II, and he's referred to as Parak, and he has springs in his shoes, and he jumps from roof to roof, and he actually is used to defeat. He's like a folk hero, and he defeats the SS, and he defeats Hitler in these sort of cartoons of the time. So it's the same figure. He's just doing different things in different cultures, right? Remember a little bit earlier I talked about flying saucers. The flying saucer community in England in the 50s actually thought Springheeled Jack was likely to be some kind of alien astronaut. So you see a depiction of the 1954 Flying Saucer Review, Flying Saucer, a periodical that went on for years and years and years. And they're depicting Springheeled Jack as some type of alien astronaut. So you can see how some of what's going on here has to do with community, right? And communal reinforcement. People who have interests in flying saucers have a different set of values and a different use for the narrative than somebody who's an aristocrat, than somebody who is a commoner telling their kid to, hey, just get in here before it's dark or Springheeled Jack is going to get you. This suggests that this suggests very highly, it suggests that Springheeled Jack is a kind of folk tool or something like an urban myth, right? That is the product of communal reinforcement. Now, why does this matter? Why are we studying Springheeled Jack? It's some monster that occurred hundreds of years ago. I mean, really, what does this matter? This is, of course, about critical thinking. Well, communal reinforcement takes place today too, right? It doesn't stop just because we're 200 years later. We are facing these same kinds of difficulties. If you look at issues involving global warming, look at global data, and you find that conservative individuals throughout the globe all doubt global warming. It seems to be a function of their group, right? So there's widespread scientific consensus on this point, right? That there is climate change that mankind is contributing to and so forth. But certain communities don't accept that data, and they consider it a hoax. And remember, it's reinforced throughout that community and treated as fact. Now, maybe more than ever, it's important to point out to you, I'm not here grading you on whether or not you think global warming is true or false or whatever, right? This isn't really a course on politics. But if you are in a community of individuals, and those individuals all adhere to the same stance with regard to climate change, so whether you're liberal or conservative, as an individual, your duty is to say, wait a minute, is there consensus on this? What is the scientific consensus for global warming? Is it good or bad? Various healthcare practices become a matter of communal reinforcement. So often you'll get groups of people who, in a commune, begin to believe in miraculous properties of a plant, and that this plant can treat all sorts of illnesses and so forth. And even though there's no evidence that that's true, it becomes part of the group's identity that it is true. And so they will refuse to consider contrary evidence. Another great example of this was the vaccination danger, or more properly, the idea that vaccinations caused autism. There was little to no evidence that this was true, and in fact it was later disproven many, many times. There was a profound amount of money spent trying to determine whether there was a link between vaccination and autism. There wasn't, but even still, those types of falsehoods circulated through communities, and it becomes extremely difficult to undo them because part of what binds those communities together is the narrative. So whatever issue it is, right, whether you think there's some miraculous property to a plant, whether you think that global warming, right, man-made global warming is a hoax, right, whatever it is, whatever your stance is, you are very likely, your belief reflects that of other members in the community. And as a critical thinker, you need to examine that evidence for yourself. It's not something that I can tell you. It's something that you need to determine on your own. Okay, you guys, so now we're going to move on to a discussion of form and content with regard to Springheeled Jack. And the first thing I want to point out is there's a researcher named Mike Dash in England, and he is currently writing a book about Springheeled Jack. And it's going to be a huge, massive book, but he's not done yet, and it's taken him, like, I think 30 years to write it. So this point is wholly Mike Dash's, but what Mike Dash points out is there's an inverse relationship between the House of Parliament and Springheeled Jack. Now, what does this matter? What does this have to do with form and content? Let's go back and start at the beginning. Remember, the form of a claim is how it comes to you. And what Mike notices is there are fewer instances of Springheeled Jack appearing when Parliament is in session. Okay, what that means is, what he concludes is, there's more news when the House of Parliament is in session. There are different bills that are before the House. There are different disputes and political cases, right? There's more news going on then. When the House of Parliament is not in session, we see that there's an increase in the sightings of Springheeled Jack. Well, what does that mean? Think again about how we're getting the stories of Springheeled Jack. We're getting them in little circulars that cost a penny to buy, and they're read by everyday people like me and you. Well, what this suggests is, right, I mean, well, this is just true. These are products, right? These are stories, and they're trying to sell these stories to people so that they'll purchase them, and the publishers make money. Well, there aren't as many stories when Parliament is in session, or there are plenty of stories when Parliament's in session, but when it's not, it's kind of dull, and it's kind of slow. And so what Mike Dash found was, writers, people who would write for these penny dreadfuls, would go back and recycle almost verbatim different stories about Springheeled Jack. Why? Times were slow. This Springheeled Jack story sold really well 2 years ago. Let's rehash it now, and people would buy it up and eat it up. And so it looks like Springheeled Jack was almost one of the space fillers of his time. It was a way to tell a sensational tale and sell the journal. Springheeled Jack is no more real than Black Bess is. I mean, there was not really historically some Black Bess who's doing something with the stagecoach here. It's a story, and people buy it because they want to read about the Knight of the Road. Similarly, there's no historical boy detective who's going around London at this time solving crimes. It's a story. And the point about form and content is the form of the claims concerning Springheeled Jack come from these kind of sensationalized tabloids. They're not likely to be true, and the people who are reading them might not have even thought they were true. But it's only because we're so far removed from this, right, 200 years and a country away, that we think that these accounts are true. So here you can see where, when you understand the form of the claim, Springheeled Jack was a creature who ran around Victorian England attacking people. When we look at the form of that claim, we see that it's tied to a somewhat unreliable source, or at least a source whose goal is to make money, not necessarily convey truth. That is really the linchpin, right? These stories are supposed to entertain us. They're not necessarily going to be true and real. And the connection to Parliament suggests just a more reasonable alternative than some supernatural figure jumping around. Instead, it just seems to suggest, look, these were space fillers, man. These were just people who were trying to fill space and sell ad time. They weren't really cases of people being attacked. Okay, I hope that's helpful. I hope Springheeled Jack is a little more interesting for you guys. There are several questions on the quiz about him, so make sure that you keep your head up.